Okay, good people. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. We're not late, by the way, just because I don't know what happened, but we were on time, and actually we are on LinkedIn. So go over to LinkedIn to watch the first part of the show. Today, I am joined by Pastor Mashaun Simon again. Thank you for being patient. So again, like I said, we've already been on the air for like 15 minutes. Actually 20 minutes, having some great conversation. It was good. It was good. Definitely a hallelujah good time. So anyways, I'm happy to have him here. So I'm going to start again, just, thanking him for coming on the show. Taking the time, I don't know if the fanfare if it causes the same type of effect, basically. But I appreciate you. So tell the people about kind of like why you got here. Like I said, this wasn't the uniform.
This was not planned.
This wasn't the uniform.
This was not planned.
So tell people how you got into pastoring and why this is. To me, I'll be honest, I feel like this is something that's close to you, which is why I kind of like reached out to you, not just even because I reached out to you before your father had passed.
Yep.
And just because I thought it was like an area, I was like, this would be amazing to talk about this. So what made you interested in it, and like, how did you get to this place?
So, yeah, I've told this story time and time again. I never wanted to be a pastor. Never was interested in pastoring. Never was interested in ministry. But I always knew or felt that there was something tugging at me to say, have impact in the world. And my career started in the journalism world. I was a journalist full time for a great many years. I don't even know how many years. One of my friends sat down and was like, I think you've been a journalist for like 15 years now. And I was like, how? Like, I'm only in my early 40s. That seems like a long time. But yeah, so was sort of in this realm of writing and informing, which is why my tagline is preacher, teacher, writer, scholar, because my writing was also sort of just informing the world. I enjoyed learning things and then putting those things back out into the world. So ministry was just sort of something that sprung up as I was finding myself, one, frustrated with the sensationalism of the journalism world, or print journalism more specifically. And then two, finding myself frustrated with the church. Having grown up here in the metropolitan Atlanta area, coming out at a very young age, and what I was taught about the Bible before coming out didn't line up with how people treated me after I came out. And it was also part of the reason why I ran from the call. But what I began to recognize and realize is that there are people hurting in the world who need someone or some place to sort of just be their safe space. And so it allowed me to lean into ministry in a certain kind of way that felt as though I could be impactful by being a voice, an outlet, a support to those who the church just didn't love the way I felt as though they should have been loved. So that's how I got there. That's how I got to ministry. That's how I got to pastoring. Prior to becoming a pastor. And then, a lot of people have heard the story of how I ended up pastoring because my pastor was dying from colorectal cancer. And man said to me, I want you to be the one to continue this ministry. You're the only one who can continue this ministry because the people are going to need someone to care for them and also lead them through this journey of losing him. And so I reluctantly said yes and did that for a year and some change until I decided leading a congregation was not where I think God wants me to be right now. So yeah.
You know, one of the things, Pastor Simon, that stands out to me that I'm gonna like be just on that I love is that you are on social media and you talk openly about your grieving experience with your with the loss of your father. And I find honestly a lot of pastors or pastors that I have had experience with, not my own, Reverend Dr. Calvin O. Butts III is an amazing man.
Reverend Butts is your pastor. Okay. He's an amazing pastor and an amazing preacher. Like
yes.
Wow.
Yes. But one of the things, like I said, that I love is that you basically show that you're human, that you are a human going through it. I think that maybe one of the only other Black pastors that I've seen who is kind of like notably like up there is like when Marvin Sapp's wife died, and he was just like, I was like, wow, this man is. And then at the moment, I was like, oh, he's broken. But then at the moment, he's human. So what got you there? Is it just like I just want to be transparent, or is there something else that God leads you to be so openly about being human?
That's a good question because I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before. I think the simplest reaction for me is it just makes sense. Like if I'm preacher, teacher, writer, scholar, actually step back. My preaching mentor and the woman I call my mother in ministry, the Reverend Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, who is the Bandy Chair of Preaching at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, told us one day when I was in seminary that the preaching moment is an each and everyday moment. Preaching just does not happen, and ministry just does not happen when you're at the pulpit. You are preaching every day of your life, every moment of your life. And I really took that in. I really took that to my core because what it helped me, what it encapsulated for me was that people are paying attention to you even when you don't realize they are. And people are making assumptions, observations, characterizations of you when you are at your highest, but especially when you're at your lowest. And I don't like that pedestal. I don't like it. But what I recognized was it started back then for me that who I am as an individual, people are paying attention to regardless if I like it or not. And so why not lean into it? And but what I've also recognized, especially in this season since my father passed, because my father passed in October 2021, was, and I've told people this before, Pierre passed August of 2020. And people were looking to me to sort of see how they could be or how they could move forward past Pierre's passing. And then I kept having people around me who were losing their mothers, their fathers, other loved ones, and calling me to sort of walk the journey with them or journey this grief with them. And it's just sort of went off as a light bulb of like, people are hurting. And one, I am pastoring people. There are people who may never walk into a sanctuary that I lead, but they will still see me as their pastor. Whether they see something I post on Instagram or whether they see me in the grocery store, they will still see me as their pastor. So that was one part to it. The other part to it, though, also is my father had a stroke now 6 years ago. And I have been, people around me know this, bracing myself for his passing for at that time, 5 years. And I would say, when my father goes, when my father goes, when my father goes, and people hated hearing me say that. They felt like it was morbid. And I was like, no, at some point in time, this man is going to die. My father, when he died, was 88 years old. When he had his stroke, he was partially paralyzed and developing dementia. He's not going to live forever. But what that did was it put me in this space of anticipating the death, which I thought was preparing me for the death, and it really wasn't. So when he died, I started sharing on social media because it was therapy for me. Expressing what I was going through was therapy for me. Saying I miss him was therapy for me. Because I also recognize in my life that I don't hold stuff in very well. Like it has to get out of me, because if it sits in me, it festers, and that's not healthy for me. Not mentally, not emotionally, not physically. So it was a both. It was a both end. It was therapy for me to sort of let it out, but it was also there are people paying attention, and especially now that there are people who have lost. I cannot tell you how many people I know that have lost parents since COVID started, and did not lose parents because of COVID. Like they lost parents, old age, cancer, lung issues, all kinds of stuff. And that's also a different kind of grief. Like losing someone to COVID is a certain level of trauma, I believe. Losing a parent in the midst of a pandemic, when everybody's talking about the pandemic, is also another form of trauma. And so I felt like my congregation were orphans. This virtual congregation I'm now leading, if you will. And no, I'm not starting another church. So, but in a sense, like there are people who are following me who are dealing with the same kind of pain I'm dealing with. And so let's be community in a certain kind of way. And I'm going to share where I am, and you can share as well.
Now, something you brought up is really interesting. Kind of, I don't know if research shows this, but anecdotally, do you feel like grieving since the beginning of this pandemic is a different experience than before?
I do. I do. I think that, so my research is looking at grief from a theological perspective, but also from a practical perspective. Like, what does the Bible say about grief? What has the church done as it pertains to grief? In the midst of that, what I'm also looking at is the impact that grief has on us, or sort of the presence of grief, like the physiology of grief, if you will. And what I've been able to recognize is pandemic grief is different because of the limits that pandemic has created for us. So like when people have died, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we couldn't have funerals. Funerals, especially in the Black community.
My family did, but
y'all was brave.
Trust me, I was livid.
I believe it.
Livid.
I believe it.
Livid that my grandmother was at a funeral. I get it. That my aunt had passed, but like a cousin or a third aunt had passed. But I was like, "Are you serious?"
Because it's scary. Yeah.
Funeral. And
Yep. Yep. Black folk can be a little stubborn at times, but I also recognize like the power of the funeral. The funeral it's ritual, it's traditional, it's an opportunity to celebrate, but it's also an opportunity to say goodbye. And I know a lot of people. My aunt died at the beginning of the pandemic, April 2020. We didn't get a chance to have a funeral, and in Michigan, they were requiring that if a person died from COVID, they had to be cremated immediately. One, because they didn't have space to house all these bodies, but two, they didn't know what the disease was doing to bodies, so they wanted you cremated immediately. So there was that part, like there was this limit that people weren't getting an opportunity to say goodbye. in a way that we're used to, especially in the Black community.
Especially in the Black community. Mm-hmm.
But I think also it has impacted grief in a different kind of way because we are all, for the most part, that's a generalization, but there's a good percentage of us that are being forced with our own mortality now because of this pandemic, and afraid of death in a way that our generation and maybe the generation behind us have never had to consider in a certain kind of way. Our parents' generation, maybe they've seen some things. Like my father at 88 was alive when Emmett Till was killed. Like they've seen some things. But our generation and below, I think, haven't had to experience the level of struggle. And I could be wrong, and again, this is a generalization, but the way in which those before us experienced trauma and grief and the setbacks of life, oppression, racism, genocide almost, we haven't had to see it the way they did. And so it's impacting us because we're being faced with our mortality in a different kind of way now. And I think pandemic has caused that. Like there are people who are afraid. I know people who didn't go, me being one of them, didn't go outside for a long time when this pandemic started because we were afraid.
Right.
And being faced with that and the idea of struggling for death, struggling through death, dying, and leaving loved ones is a different perspective for a lot of us.
I just want to pause for a second because we got some people who wrote in. So we have Derek who says, absolutely, sometimes your life is the only Bible that some people get to read. So yeah, thank you, Derek. And like Justin wrote, you seem so at peace now. Another one is, so we'll talk a bit about complex grief. But Justin said he lost his mother to COVID. It's the hardest day of his life, and he still is hurting after 6 months later. And it's funny that we talk about kind of like grieving, because I remember actually in school that my professors and some really like what I thought was some brilliant and talented master therapists, I don't know if I'll ever get there, would say, that 6 months is quite a long time to still be kind of grieving like it happened yesterday. But we're seeing more and more people who are having long-term complex grief from this loss.
I'm a contrarian at times, and so I think one of the reasons why I'm doing this research is I think that we as a society have been forced to move on beyond our grief before we were ready. Like I love this quote and I'm not a huge comic book fan or what have you, but Vision says in the Disney Plus series of WandaVision, what is grief but love persevering? And I love that quote because it lifts up for me this reality that grief is a part of life. It is a part of process because we lose the people we love, and we have to deal with their absence. And so because of that, our grief sort of has this spectrum. Like, it can be, some people are okay after 2 or 3 weeks. Some people are not okay after 20 years. I lost my brother. My brother died from HIV and AIDS in 1992. I was 13 years old. I grieved his death as if it had just happened well into my 30s. One of the reasons was because I was so young. He and I had a certain kind of relationship. We both were Black gay men. There was a connection, and he was my brother. And when he died, I don't know if I ever was given the ability to have closure, because the church has taught us he don't have to suffer anymore. He's in a better place. God needed him. And it's like, I don't deny any of that. But what about me? What about the pain and the struggle that I am now experiencing because this person is gone. Like, it's unfair, even though death is a part of our lives. And so I struggle with this idea that there's a time limit on grief. I don't know if that's true. And in this work that I'm doing, I don't see that. Yeah, I seem to be okay. My father died in October, but I'm not. Like, what's today? Saturday?
Right.
Thursday night, I had a dream about my dad. And I woke up yesterday morning and I had a, excuse my language, shitty day for the rest of the day because that dream brought up a whole lot. And I had to, and I was telling someone this morning about it, I stopped and sat down and paused and said, okay, what does this dream mean for me? How can I process through this dream so that I am not in the mud of this emotion all day? And I had a friend of mine who was like, that was your father's way of communicating with you. And I was like, based off of the dream, I think that may have been God's way of communicating something to me. And it gave me answers that I needed to get me through. But I give that story because that is an example of I wasn't okay. I wasn't okay yesterday. I'm not okay today. Losing my father, I am my father's only living male child now. I carry his name. I carry his face. What does that mean for me going forward? Who now am I that I don't have my father in the world with me to sit with and talk to and brag to? This man, I've been told, walked around and bragged on me all the time. He bragged on all of his children all the time. I never really knew that. I sort of knew it, but I didn't really know it until the day of his funeral. That did something for me. Like, that shifted something for me because my father and I had baggage for a good majority of our lives. Like, I always thought my father had an issue with me and my sexuality. Apparently he didn't. So now I'm learning these things, and it is sort of shifting how I perceive my relationship to him, which is shifting how I understand myself in the world. I'm not okay. I'm learning to get through it, and I think the reality of grief is, which is why I'm also doing this research, is I think we should do a better job of journeying through grief with the people that are grieving. And too often, I don't know if we want to or have the capacity or the wherewithal to stop and say, I'm with you in this. I may not understand it, but I'm here for you. We're too busy saying, let's celebrate the life, let's move on. And the Bible has also shown us that. The Bible has shown us people had these moments, they grieve, they move on. And I don't know if that's healthy for us.
Right. I was about to ask you, what is your advice? What is your guidance as, in your role and in your experience for an individual as they deal with grief from a biblical, I guess, theological kind of perspective?
That's hard. Because again, and I think I said this earlier, I was that person who was like, let's burn the Bible and start all over. Like, this thing is tragic. And what are we going to do with this? I am in this interesting space now where I am looking at the Bible and seeing the ways in which people have grieved, or the ways in which people did not grieve. So a perfect example, I just finished, I think I said I'm 2 years into a 4-year program of a doctor of ministry. I just finished a class while I had COVID. We'll talk about that later. I was taking a class on the book of Job. And, for years, we've been told that Job was a story about this man who lost everything and yet he did not, he was favored by God, and yet he did not turn on God. And as a result, God rewarded him. And I have struggled with that text for years. Because I'm just like, there's so many problematic pieces to this. Looking at this class and looking at my research, I'm convinced Job is a book about grief. That what you see is what I've seen people go through as they've been grieving. He lost something suddenly, didn't know how to make sense of it for whatever reason. Was it God? Was it the devil? We don't know. But something happened that caused him to lose everything. And for 30 plus chapters, he is reacting to this. His friends are doing what we do. Just trust God. Believe in God. Don't turn your back on God. And Job's like, no, screw this. Like, this hurts. This is painful. This is difficult. This is unfair. And then even in this exchange that Job has with God, where God never really doesn't really answer Job, doesn't really say, I did this because God just says, all of this is part of the natural order of life. And eventually Job says, okay. And that is what we do in grief. We get to acceptance. The book of Job for me is the stages of grief. And as a result of that, from a biblical perspective, I, one, am frustrated with the church because we've never had that conversation like that before. And two, I say from a biblical perspective, grief is a part of the journey or the experience of life. And for me, the Bible really is a collection of writings, almost like a diary, where people sort of were living their lives, and what we get is what they believe God's role had been in the situations of their life. And so we can look back at a text and say, Job lost everything. He vented about it. He yelled at God about it. And then eventually he made peace with it. And he continued, and it changed him. Because then at the end of the book, God grants him all these riches, all these children, and he builds a different kind of relationship with his children post his grief than he did prior to his grief. So that's, for me, a almost a narrative or a guide for these are the ways in which you can walk through it. Have it, live it, experience it. Yell at God if you need to. God's okay. God's feelings are not going to be hurt. But let it change you. Let it show you that life can still be lived, and learn lessons that may help you to be different and better and stronger and wiser on the other side of it.
As we kind of get closer to wrapping this thing up, and I just think about some people who are conflicted, and say, as we think about, we've lost millions of people to COVID, millions across the world to COVID, and individuals who say, how can God have let this happen?
Yeah.
I have personally in my work buried generations, grandparents, parents, and the children, all at the days from one another. And it there is an emotional pain that comes with that, not just for the family, but the caregivers who are out here doing this work. And they're like, well, how can God let this much pain happen?
Yeah.
What do you do? What do you say?
I'm asking that very same question. I am having that very same thought. God, why? And saying to God, how, why would you let this be? In the beginning of the pandemic, I asked that question so many times, I thought I had an answer. And I was like, oh, maybe this is the earth, the environment saying, you have abused me. This is my way of retaliating. Like, that's really what I was. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, this is the earth retaliating against us. And then I got to a point of, I don't know. Like, the reality is, and I get it, I understand. We want to understand. We want to know. We want to have the questions because it makes life easier. It makes life more bearable. If we have a connection to the reason of this, then it will allow us to be a certain way, live a certain way, operate a certain way, understand to a certain extent. So I get it. I understand why those questions are asked. I understand why we have a tendency to say to God, why would you let this happen? But in the instance of Job, we may never get the answer that we want. We may not like the answer that we get. In the the book of Job, God pretty much says, "Who are you to question me? Because I've done all this, and I can control the worst of the things and the easiest of the things." And so for me, that what that does for me is it helps me to recognize that I don't know. I don't know why God does it, and I don't know if having an answer to it is going to help us or save us in any kind of way. I just don't. What I think we can do, or what I have been doing, is stopping and sitting and just sort of saying, what about my life can I change? What about my life can I? One of the things that that I appreciate from this pandemic experience that I think has been beneficial is the ways in which it has altered a lot of our commitment to ourselves. The great resignation that they've been writing about in the news, that everyone's leaving their jobs and making a different kind of choice around how they're spending their time.
Right.
Pastors are leaving churches. People are leaving jobs that they had been in for 15, 20 years because they wanted something better. For me, that's sort of been my reaction to it. How can I live a healthier and more whole life in the midst of this experience, in the midst of this reality? Because I don't think God's going to ever give me the answer. And if God does give me an answer, I don't know if I'm going to like the answer I get. And that's just going to make me that much more frustrated. The other thing that I also realize is God is so much bigger than me. And I don't know if I want to understand all things of God. I don't know if I want that burden. I don't know if I want that clarity. And so I am attempting to help people consider and think about. I see someone just did a Matthew 5:4 quote.
Yes.
I am. There is a Matthew scripture that says, "Why worry? Why worry about what you eat? Why worry about what you wear? Why worry about all these other things? Consider the birds, how they fly. Consider the lilies of the field. Yada yada yada. Blah blah blah." I enjoy that text. It is one of my favorite texts. But I also think that it is a disservice when we tell people not to worry, and actually just tell people to live. Question God, yell at God if you need to, but don't stay there. Don't be stuck there. Figure out what you can do with what you have. Figure out what ways can you continue to honor those that you lost, their legacy, their purpose, what they taught you, what they left you with, and figure out what is it that you need for your wholeness, your freedom, your happiness, your peace, so that you can live the kind of life that I think God really wants us to live, that is a life of joy and peace and purpose. Learning and living and having experiences and being changed by them or impacting people, but being whole and free, I think is what God really wants of us, and what I'm trying to tell people to focus their energy on.
You know, there's been also this thing as I think about kind of like I feel like there's I won't say, this movement of community leaders or a movement of individuals who are not the stronger of us, because that's not the right way of saying it, but they are able to seem to pick up the pieces a little bit easier, and they are able to show up and also help others. What is your advice, or what is your encouragement for them, or those of us who recognize that may be our station in life, to be a leader and to be supposedly the strong one? Because now I like the thing where they say, check on your strong
friends.
Because they also have the ability to be weak. They can be weak. But what is your advice? What fortifies them? What would you think is useful advice for them?
To take care of themselves. One of the reasons why I stepped down from congregation leadership was because I recognized I was doing a terrible job of taking care of me. And while I was trying to make sure they were okay, that they were healthy and whole and happy, I was gaining weight because of my own grief. I wasn't sleeping well. I was dealing with anxiety like I'd never dealt with before. And I think the church has also done a terrible job with this, of forcing leaders, community leaders, society, if you will, um, of being selfless to a fault. And so my advice would be, make sure you take care of yourself, rest. Don't pour yourself into this mission or this purpose above and beyond what you need. Pay attention to your body, pay attention to your mind and what it is saying. Have fun, go to a movie, go to the park, spend time with your family, um, drink a bottle of wine, like get your life. Have a work-life balance where you are just not letting the call, the purpose, the ministry eat you up or destroy you or wear you out. There is a way that you can balance it. There is a way that you can be selfless and selfish, and that is not a bad thing. Take care of yourself.
You know, one of my viewers, Norma Rogers, said, "Yes, check on your strong friends." It's funny that she says that because she's probably, I think, probably my strongest friends.
Oh, that's
She's probably one of my
sweet.
strongest friends. So
So you need to make sure you check on her.
Exactly, exactly. Norma always has a smile on her face. I can't. God, self, family, then everything else. Says Norma. Then Justin says, "Amen, self care," and then he
Justin.
Yes, exactly. And he also said earlier, a little bit earlier, said, "Well said, Pastor Simon. Grief is complex. It's a personal journey. It takes as long as it takes."
Yeah.
Yeah, that's those are great points, and I love those, the reality of it. But let's just be honest. Let's go into the science behind it. Because I can't tell somebody's employer I'm putting my patient out on complex grieving for a year. They're going to say you're out of your mind and your patient's fired. They're going to go to a book that's codified in research and data and science and say, if he's not back within this amount of time and you prove it like by this, then so be it. What do you see as, I would not say the fate of the world, because that's huge. That's huge.
Oh, the world is trash. We're burning and we're burning fast.
But what do you see as the transformation of a more human approach to the science, the system, and the things that are put in place supposedly so people don't take advantage of it? What do you see as the reality? Do you see we're stuck and that's not, or do you see a movement of folks kind of saying this makes absolutely no sense?
I think what's going to happen, or what is happening, I think the Great Resignation is impacting that. I mentioned it a little bit earlier that like people are making a different kind of choice for themselves. That, I mean, we're a society that's built on capitalism. Like, I don't think capitalism is ever going to go away.
No.
But I think I'm hopeful that what will happen is these organizations will start to pay attention to their workforce in a certain kind of way, to recognize that they need this workforce. And so it's best to be their allies than to be their oppressor. I don't know what that's going to look like, but what I am hopeful about, and this is why I think my research is important, is by looking at, by sort of engaging this perspective from in a certain kind of way of critiquing what is and providing thoughts or considerations for what should be, for recognizing that grief is a journey, and that we should journey with our people. I am hopeful that this next generation sort of latches on to that, because the reality is this next generation are going to be the leaders. This next generation are going to be the ones who are going to be leading these organizations and these companies. And so hopefully if we can expose them, this is why I think this is why I'm convinced that like this whole fight that's happening around CRT and all this other stuff is because those on the other side also recognize that this next generation is coming up and trying to have their certain level of impact on this next generation. And so I'm hopeful that there are those in this next generation and some of us of my generation who are paying attention in a different kind of way, and that this pandemic is causing them to lead with their hearts more than just solely leading from their pockets. That is my hope. I don't, like I said, this world is trash and we're burning down every day. Like the earth is on fire, so I don't know. But that is my hope.
Right. Well, we're gonna make it work as long as we can make it work. My family has moved out of the U.S., so
Oh wow.
you know, they're like,
Oh, that's why y'all spend so much time in Africa. I get it now.
yes,
I
they
understand.
said I want a different kind of like thing. Capitalism has its place for some people, but lost its luster for them. So, anyways, well, thank you so much again, so much
Thank
for
you.
like, like bang on this thing.
Thank you.
This people need this topic. It's been overwhelming, and I don't think we can talk about it enough from the number of perspectives, from a psychological perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from I mean, even a physical, like food perspective. Like I found myself just like bawling the other day after, like, you know, cooking one of my grandmother's favorite dishes and blah 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 blah, and you know, so, and just the food that she used to cook nourish our body, and it just like brought all back all these kind of memories. So yeah, so let's see. I got some last few comments. So Justin said, another great show. Thank you so much, Justin. Also, my girl Norma. Thank you, Norma. She said, thank you. I needed this today. Yeah, I appreciate you so much.
I thank you. I thank you. I thank you for the invitation. As I said, I am 2 years into a 4-year program, and so this whole idea of grief being my lane, you couldn't have told me this would be something I'd be doing 3 years ago. So to be able to come here and talk about it and share it with the masses as I'm developing what this looks like long term, it's a gift for me. So thank you. Thank you for affirming and confirming it for me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll be honest, I don't treat grief. At this point, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, and in the world of CBT, you cannot say somebody's grief is irrational.
Yeah.
That their feelings, their thoughts about it are irrational.
Yeah.
So I typically refer individuals who are grieving to somebody who is a little bit more, who has a different approach. I used to use CBT for grieving, but I cannot tell somebody, you know, again, that it's a rational way to process.
I have this idea in my research of sort of engaging at the end of it, developing like a resource, because what I recognize is like there are not a lot of Black gay grief therapists. There are not a lot of,
that's a haystack.
Right. There are not a lot of, and so I'm thinking through like, how can I take this research and everything that I'm finding and create this space, one-stop shop, if you will, for people to go to and find the resources and the support that they need. Like that's sort of the next step, I think, of my research. I'm not sure, but you saying that definitely like brought that up for me, because there is a difference in the kind of work that is done from a psychotherapy perspective, that we don't always consider people just like, oh, they're a therapist that can help. And it's like, no. They're areas of focus. And I'm not a therapist either. I see mine every third Thursday of the month. But yeah, and she's not a grief therapist either. So,
right. Well, you're welcome, Tasia. She said, I needed this, waking up missing my mother. Well, guys, we are out of time. My psychotherapeutic hour is over, and you have a great rest of your Saturday.